Hi everybody, my name is Jazz Cole, and I'm basically here to talk about a psycholinguistic perspective on language learning. So I'm going to get into it. To really discuss what psycholinguistics really is, it's a branch of linguistics as a whole. And I want to say a misconception is that linguistics means like you learn all these different, no. We're not necessarily learning languages, we are studying language, like singular, like how certain languages function. Some people may be focusing on specific languages, like for me, my focus is mainly Latin and Germanic based, because that's the majority of the languages that I speak. We might happen to speak different languages, but it's not a requirement. We're just mainly studying how languages work, how it functions. A really great definition is from like the Oxford bibliographies. Sheila M. Kennison and Rachel H. Messer said that psycholinguistics is the field of study in which researchers investigate the psychological processes involved in the use of language, including language comprehension, language production, and first and second language acquisition. So my focus is mostly on language comprehension as well as first and second. Well, actually, no, focus is on second language acquisition because like I said, there's a lot of different things you can research within these branches. And I also have a video where I explained the differences between those different branches of linguistics. So there are a lot of different components. For me, it's mostly second language acquisition, and I'm usually researching what are the best ways to learn a language, because a lot of times there's a lot of resources out there, there are a lot of apps, there are a lot of things that can promise you that you can be fluent in a certain amount of time. And I will just say through my discovery is that fluency doesn't exist. I always tell my students your goal should be to be proficient. Like you can communicate what you need to communicate and be able to understand as much as you can. So the goal of language, of course, is communication. That's the whole point from cavemen on is we are trying to communicate with other people. And of course with language, as we have I think there's about 7,000 different languages within the world. So there are a lot of different ways you can communicate with people. And my way of thinking of it is that language, it's all really the same. We're all saying the same thing, or we're at least trying to say the same thing, but the only difference is that it sounds different. When I think of the fact that since my focus is mainly Latin and Germanic languages, a lot of them are related to each other. So like seeing the crossovers and how we can kind of make connections. So especially like also not only am I a psycholinguist in training, but also I teach privately. And so when you teach privately, you get to have like more of a personalized perspective for each student that you teach, since like they all have different needs. I mean, I have a student right now, I've been working with him for almost 3 months. About 2 months, so to say. He's in 8th grade and he's trying to learn French because I think one parent, I want to say his mom's side of the family is from Montreal. So the needs there are going to be different. There's the dialect. This is more or less sociolinguistics. There's a dialect. There's a completely different accent. There's also a different culture. So those are things that I have to really consider when I am researching things for him to do, for daily activities. These are things to keep in mind. And I also since I keep track of everyone's progress, it also helps me be able to see what they need to work on. Because with second language acquisition, the most part I'm always working, because again, second language, I'm not teaching anyone a first language because no, that's more of like a parent, when you're trying to get your kid to learn, to say things like their first words and, their phrases and things like that. With second language acquisition, I'm working with students who already have a language that they kind of have down pat, at least one or maybe two. I've had students who, I have a student who's living in Ohio and she's learning French because she just wants to work in Belgium. So that's a completely different need, a completely different accent, dialect. Actually, no, the accent is not that different, but the dialect for sure. And I'm looking at methodology because, like I said, it's based on how the mind works. And so we can't confuse psycholinguistics with neurolinguistics, which is a whole other thing. Neurolinguistics is more like your brain, like your anatomy. More so it's like psycholinguistics more or less has to do with your mind and how you process the information that you're learning. So one of the things I'm also looking at, like I said, my thing is learning the best and most effective ways to learn. I specifically am looking at the Montessori pedagogy because Dr. Maria Montessori, her methodology of teaching is pretty incredible to me. It's fascinating because it does create results. And I'm interested to basically research what that looks like in a foreign language environment versus just teaching in general, like general subjects. Because I actually went to a Montessori school growing up when I was about like 3 all the way to like 9 years old, 8 or 9 years old. So I was so used to that. And that was actually funny because when I transitioned to an art school, like I auditioned for theater, that was my thing, until I graduated high school. So I was so thrown off when I got to public school because the only methodology that I knew how to learn was through the Montessori method and their whole classroom setup, the way that teachers were, the way that teachers played a role as more of a facilitator than like the expert. Because I feel like even as a non-native speaker who is teaching foreign languages, is that you have a different perspective because when you're a second language teacher or, a foreign language teacher of any kind, if it's your second or third language or so on, is you're constantly looking at it as a pattern because you're still learning it really. I'm still learning new things every day in all of the languages that I speak. Regardless of kind of even English sometimes, new vocabulary or new words to add into the repertoire. But I'm really looking at the fact that, like, for example, with the Montessori method, is the role of a facilitator. So it's more of like student driven. The students get to basically tell the teachers what they want to learn, and the teacher's responsibility is to teach them that. Whether it be doing and it's a great challenge because it teaches you to do your own research. You're learning all these different things yourself. And teaching is basically the best way to actually learn anyway, because you're kind of reiterating what you already know to students. And so for the most part, like, I'm really interested in how that really works and how effective that can be to a student's education, considering that boredom can be the number one reason why students don't learn. They might check out, especially if it's not relevant to them, in that sense. So, yeah. I'm also looking into the foreign language deficit within the United States. Because this is mainly because there are a lot of opportunities that are available in the U.S., whether you're working in government, at a federal, state, or even local level. When we're looking at international business, commerce, there are a lot of opportunities there. So the main thing is that when we have all these different positions and all these different opportunities available, and we don't have enough people who are available to speak it, that really makes a big difference. I mean, if you look at Found in Translation, How Language Shapes Our Lives and Transforms the World. I did a book review on that. But basically, they talk about, like, one of the things they talk about in this book is that 9/11 was actually preventable. They didn't have the people to translate it. They were talking about the fact that they intercepted those calls, like, literally the day before. And it didn't get translated until the day after 9/11 happened on the 12th. So when we think about these things, there are a lot of languages really saves lives. It creates opportunities, especially if you're in certain industries. It's more so, I feel like language is more of it's something that everyone should learn no matter what industry you're in, because it can always coincide. So if you're looking at being a doctor, someone in healthcare, then for the most part, you have, if you take a second language, you can basically apply those skills to your job. If you're basically going into, let's say you're going into a field of maybe, in my case, I went to the fashion industry. That was where my background was. Fashion is a global industry. I mean, I remember working interning for Halston, and they had offices in other countries, and they had relationships with other people outside of the U.S. So there's a lot of opportunities there, a lot of business opportunities, in the private and public sector. So, and it also can make us more competitive if more people, more adults can actually master 2 languages, in addition to, you know, the native language. And also, like, sometimes, like, I also think about the age factor, because when we look at the fact that, like, people tell me all the time, they're like, oh, well, younger kids, or, you know, when you're really young, like, you can learn languages, like, quickly. I would say, I mean, it can be relatively, I don't know how I would really answer that, because I was an au pair for 4-year-old children, and I remember, you know, trying to teach them English. That was the whole point, one of the, you know, reasons why I was there, you know, and it was difficult, you know, especially like with your children, like I said, with second language acquisition. First language acquisition, that's a whole different thing, especially if you're coming from like a bilingual household. With second language acquisition, you're trying to get someone who's been accustomed to speaking a certain way to speak another way. You know, I remember having to say, this is green. You're like, no, grün. I'm like, no, green, English. In English, wir sagen green. In English, we say green. And having to, especially like when they're really, really young, like under 5, sometimes it can be kind of, especially if they've already at some point, I don't know. So I have a completely different perspective from personal experience. But I will say that adults and children learn differently. For me, even though I'm only 26, and I've been able to acquire 10 languages, not fluent in all of them. I would not say that. Like, remember, I don't like the word fluent, because it implies that, like, you know everything, and language is constantly evolving and changing. Even in French, as long as I've been speaking that, I still come across like new slang, new expressions, like, oh, we don't say this anymore, we say this, you know. So I still come up with a lot of things. I'm relatively proficient in, I'm very proficient in the first 5. The other 5 were still kind of, it's more like on a maintenance base, because I don't use it as much. I've never had a need. Like Catalan, I don't have a need for that, but I can understand it, you know, on that kind of note. So, like, you know, when it comes to age, you know, looking at the factors of how they can learn differently. And so, like, when I come up with strategies with people who are in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, you know, of course they've grown accustomed to one language, and so I'm trying to help them make connections to the language they already know, versus with like kids, like let's say under 5, they're kind of putting that in their vocabulary as they're forming their first language, you know. So one first language is already solidified, the other one they're still trying to figure that out, you know. So more than anything else on that note. Another thing is I really think about how it's taught in school in that sense. So like I was saying with the Montessori method, and how that kind of works, versus like the I'm going to stand up and teach, you know, that kind of thing. But sometimes that can get really, it can kind of get boring after a while for a student. It's going to get boring if you're only using one way of teaching the whole class, you know, for that period of time that you have them. The application of how students are likely to carry that language into adulthood. So like I was saying with the age difference, is like based on how it's taught, and if it's taught in a way where it's relevant, more or less. And I also did another video talking about what that kind of means. You know, I have so many videos on strategies, but I mean, when I look at specifically, like, you know, how they're going to carry that into adulthood, especially because I really want to leave an impact. I don't want them to spend money for me to teach them something that they are going to forget later on and have to come back to me to, you know, to relearn. Or when it comes to things where they just kind of just check out, they're not interested. So when I think about it in a grand scheme of things, I really want my research to really allow there to be more people who are bilingual, at the very least within the United States. I'm looking at other countries specifically as to how they teach languages, how many people are specifically bilingual within those countries. You know, when you think about the fact that, like, particularly Europe, about 2/3 of the people, 2/3 of adults know how to communicate in at least 2 languages, whereas in the United States it's about just under 1/3. Okay, and it's like really ironic considering that we're a very diverse country. You know, when you think about migration and just basically like the fact that we're very multicultural, considering like our history through, you know, going all the way back to like colonialism. We're a very diverse country, but it's so ironic that It's not common that we speak two or more languages. I remember when I lived in Los Angeles, half the languages that I learned was basically because of friends. Some of them I learned because I was curious, like Catalan and Frisian. I didn't really intend on learning those. Those were not something I was looking for, but I was curious because they were secondary or minority languages within certain countries that I had already learned the language of. Like Spain, I was already learning Spanish, so Catalan was kind of something I was curious about. And then there's also, I was already learning Dutch, and I was like, well, what's this Frisian language that's spoken on the western part of the country? Being curious to look into that. And that's kind of how my brain works as a psycholinguist, is I'm trying to figure out how does this language work? Because when I was learning Frisian, I was literally learning it and I said, this is literally German and Dutch together, and I was able to figure out the patterns of how conjugation worked. I was able to kind of figure out understanding because I had the connection from other languages. So everything, the wires kind of were able to cross in a way to where I can understand what was going on. And that's kind of how I look at it, is how am I able to process those languages? That's kind of like how my mind works, especially like when I started learning Italian. I was learning 3 languages at the same time, because like when I was in college, I was learning Spanish and German. And when I graduated college, I was like, well, if I can learn 2 languages at the same time, I'm going to learn 3. So I was learning Italian, Brazilian Portuguese, and Dutch at the same time. And I would alternate days and like weeks and things like that. And and the thing was, it was so easy because all 3 of those were connected to languages I already knew. So it made it easier for me to make those connections. And humans by nature, we have to have like connections, for us to specifically to remember things, to remember people. That's why they always say, like, people might not remember what you said, but they'll remember how you've made them feel. By human nature, we're connected to people, and what kind of connections we can make out of that. All right. So I hope this kind of gives you an idea of my research a little bit, what it means to be a psycholinguistic, a person studying psycholinguistics, and the impact that it can have. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll talk to you later.